All right, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm Blake Connie, and I am a Safe Schools consultant. Part of my role is to work with districts and their behavior data, also support schools in bullying prevention, suicide prevention, and other mental health supports. So should you need help in those areas, please reach out. Love working with schools and really in all those areas. All right. Sorry, my buttons disappeared. Here we go. So I'll be addressing the behavior data standards, the reporting that goes into that, addressing some of the updates that have come. Not a ton of updates this year, but we'll get into those in just a second. Again, please use the Go Soapbox if you have any questions. Typically in person, this is fairly interactive. Everyone always has questions about what their school does, things like that we find apply to everybody. So feel free to use Go Soapbox and ask those questions. So I'm getting settled in here. All right, these resources will be available to you all. I cannot stress enough how helpful they are. So if you have questions about just the overall process or like report help, the KDE's website is extremely helpful. You can't link it here, but this will be sent out later. You can also just go to the KDE website and search behavior data or school safety, and it'll take you to these resources. And so that's the best way to get that help. So we'll be talking about the events which are pre-populated by KDE. Resolution types are based on your school district's behavior policy and local code, but those must be assigned to or tied into the state resolutions. So you might call it in-school suspension or SAFE or different acronyms for your in-school removal, but it must be tied into the state code for reporting purposes. So as I mentioned, the state reporting codes or resolution codes are as follows. Typically, the one that probably has the most issue is just that in-school removal, because they're out of the classroom, they're in a safe room or in-school suspension. What's the definition of just removing them out of the classroom temporarily versus for a period of set time? And that's, again, there's a little bit of leeway there, but if you're removing them into a supervised area for a set period of time, you want to be using in-school removal. An addition that happened in the last several years is in-district removal. So what we've seen is some districts have an alternative school or a setting outside of their school building. So it's still a supervised, it's still part of the school day or the district, but it's out of the building at an alternative placement for the day or for a short period of time. And so that's called in-district removal. So if you are assigning a student to, we'll say, an alternative school for several days, you want to use in-district removal from this point forward. So expelled with services, this is something we see once in a while. Expelled without services is a pretty rare event. So out of school suspension, corporal punishment. With the update this year, corporal punishment cannot be used on, well, it's used in very few districts, but cannot be used for students with disabilities or students that are part of the homeless or within the foster system. So if you do have a district or work in a district that utilizes corporal punishment, there are limitations now to reduce those uses. And again, students with disabilities or homeless or in foster care. There's been some clarification here on kind of removals, especially again for in-school removal. Students need to have instructional as well as non-instructional time that's similar to their peers. So if a student is removed in-school suspension or in-school removal, they still need to have access to recess, lunch, and those types of things. Now, it may look vastly different, but in terms of the number of minutes within the school day, we want to mimic a student that's not being punished schedule as much as possible. And I know that's a headache, and it's the way it is. Okay. Restraint and seclusion, again, there's very specific rules and regulations around those areas, and especially in the documentation. And so we will cover that in a few minutes here. So I've got a question here on the Go Soapbox. So will room use in school removal and alt school placement use? So alternative school replacement or school placement will use in district if it is for a specific amount of time. So if it is not like a permanent placement to the alternative school, you're going to, it's a temporary, whether it's a day, several days, a week to the alternative school, you're going to use in district removal, not change settings completely. And you won't use in-school removal if they're outside of the school building to an alternative site. I hope that makes sense to the questioner. So when entering data, this has not changed very much, and so all red boxes must be completed. Some of the questions we have, I think, come up with outside the school day, school setting sometimes can be confusing. Again, you want to use your best judgment, and the main purpose behind these, some of these things is so we can track data so that you as a school have the ability to kind of pinpoint where things are happening. With some of the reporting now and tools available, whether it's a heat map or other data tools, the more data you put in, the more accurate the data you put in, the better result you'll get, and be able to hopefully be ahead of data in the future or behavior in the future. Anytime, these boxes here, they're highlighted, but anytime you involve the police or school resource officer or court designated workers, you want to just check those boxes. Again, this is for state reporting so that the data can be pulled to see how these things are, how these resources are being used. So anytime you use one of those resources at your school, you just want to check that box when you're entering data. All right, somebody asked the question, do I need to create an in-district attendance code, or will that be pushed down from the state? That's a great question. I don't have the answer to that. Wendy Newton is really more of the kind of like technical side of it, an expert, and we will look into that. And when we get the information out to you all, we will include that question, but that's a good one. Again, as you're entering data, things that, so if you address, if you're calling it bullying, harassment, you want to make sure that you tie that into what type, and we'll cover that in just a second here. If there's an exclamation mark, besides the student name, they have an active IEP, which is important to monitor, especially when you're looking into different placements or removing from the class, to make sure they're getting the services they need. Again, if you are calling it bullying or harassment, it needs to be tied to one of the protected groups. So, color, disability, sexual orientation, etc. You just need to select it from that drop down. And I know, as a former administrator, sometimes we're hesitant to use harassment or bullying because we don't want it to show up on these reports. But I think at this point, everyone is, really seeing the value of accurate information, and this really goes to several reporting groups. We'll talk about that towards the end of this presentation. But really, for you all as a school, it's important to know what that looks like and have an accurate picture of it, because there are a lot of resources to help address bullying. Again, I'm going to put a plug in for the Old Vegas bullying prevention program that we offer free of charge through the department for any school or district that would like to implement that research-based intervention. Whenever you're entering drugs, possession of, distribution of, it must be tied to a drug type. And I know that gets just more and more confusing every year that passes. We see, different things. We see different over-the-counter items that contain THC. And I know it's a very confusing time, and drugs are more accessible than ever and more varied than ever. But it needs to be tied to a drug type whenever you're selecting that. Same thing with weapons. So again, that goes to our national reporting. So anytime there is a weapon, you must select what type of weapon it is. And the drop down for that includes, pretty much everything. All right. Probably one of the biggest errors that we see is, and you probably see as a school, is when you're entering data, the resolution, those times they overlap, or there's conflicting resolutions. You put a student in school suspension until the parent can come pick them up, and so those times don't quite match up. So as a school, you want to do whatever you can to just put a checkpoint in place. So the secretary that signs students out with the parent time slot, make sure they report that back to the attendance court clerk or to the assistant principal or principal that enter that information in, so that times can be updated to accurately reflect when the student signed out. So restraint, seclusion, I mentioned that earlier. These things are reported. They must be reported as such. When you're doing the Safe Schools report, so this is accessible anytime, and it's really recommended that schools pull this report every couple weeks or so, or even more often, to look for errors, so that it's not getting to the end of the year when this is due and you're addressing hundreds of things. So if it's under the KY, Kentucky State Reporting, the Safe Schools report, probably the best way to do that. And if you go to the KDE website and go to the behavior data page, you can see kind of a how-to of how to pull this report, and then how to actually filter, define these errors. So putting into a spreadsheet and looking at each category, you're looking for blanks, things that are left out, or things that are flagged as an error, so that you can correct it again within a reasonable time frame, because your mind's fresh. You're going to remember, oh, that kid, they didn't go home because we couldn't get in touch with the parent, so that's why they were, that's why that out of school doesn't quite match up. So every week or 2 weeks, you should have somebody in house pulling that data to make sure you're on top of it. So the Safe Schools report, again, is a yearly report that comes out. Things that are included on that are assault and violence, bullying and harassment, any types of drugs or alcohol, or weapons. And so those things need to be connected to those specific events. No matter what the resolution might be, it needs to be, call it what it is, so that they show up. And so again, we all have a good representation of what's happening. Once that, if that data is pulled, it is shared publicly, just in terms of the numbers of events or percentage of events in the school report card. The data is provided to the Kentucky Center for School Safety, to OEA, or the Office of Educational Accountability, legislative branch. They just get an overall report with numbers, percentages of issues. Anything that involves weapons or students with disabilities goes to federal reporting. Again, just numbers, nothing specific. I mentioned this earlier, but some of the tools available, but the data visualization tool, if you're not using that as a school or as a district, it is immensely helpful to see what's happening in your buildings. It can give heat maps to locations. It can give, information on which teachers are having the highest levels of referrals or issues in their classrooms, so that you can support those teachers and give them what they need to best benefit the students. Gives you areas of the school that are most prevalent in scene issues or times of the day. So, if you don't have someone in your building that is great with data and pulling ad hocs, with the visualization tool, you're able to do that without a lot of tech background or Excel background. It really makes it a very user-friendly report. Yeah, so I mentioned some of these earlier, just again, kind of the heat map at the bottom is probably one of the great staff events analysis. Events versus resolutions is a great thing as an administrative team to look at, or as a district to look at, to see, these are the types of events that are happening. Is our resolutions, are we on the same page here? Are we calibrated to get, correctly? As a school, are the resolutions we're assigning, are they effective? Are we seeing a reduction in these areas? Again, all through the data visualization tool, you can get that information. And again, on the KDE website, there is resources to support that and show you, kind of walk through how to get access to, or how to look at that data. All right, so this timeline, we're right in the middle of it. So see, as of right now, the data's been pulled. Next week, it will go out to districts to review, and then as a quick turnaround on the 29th, it needs to be done and reviewed by districts so that we can turn it over to the Kentucky Center for School Safety and OEA in the month of August. And I went quickly, so I'm gonna go to the questions here. So can you give an example of other harassments? And I'm assuming they're talking about the kind of the categories of harassed protected areas or protected roles. Nothing I can think of offhand. However, students will find new and creative ways to do things. And so, if harassment's taking place, the definition of bullying is there's a inequality of power and someone's unable to defend themselves. And so the protected groups, there's very specific definitions for those. However, a student might be harassing another student over something else, and like social economic status or income level or things like that could be considered other. Hopefully that answers your question.
Blake,
all right.
I'm sorry, Blake, something else you might want to talk about, the civil rights data collection. It requires recording of the victim and the offender for harassment and bullying.
Sorry, either I cut out or you cut out, but yeah, so yeah, whenever, yes, thank you. So anytime there's a bullying or harassment, you must record the victim. And the purpose for that, is to track, to show a behavior or repetition of pattern. Should we get to that point, or should that be needed further down the road? So thank you for that reminder.